As you likely already know, the United States military is by far the most advanced military power in the world, having hardware which far eclipses just about any other country. Despite gaining rapidly in strength in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was above all in the course of the Second World War that the US really flexed its military muscle, going on to play a decisive role in overcoming the Nazi-led Axis and bringing the ruinous war to an end. And part of the reason for this success was the US's extraordinary capacity for military innovation, incorporating a diverse array of tactics and weaponry, which sometimes obliterated and other times bamboozled its enemies. The Manhattan Project, which led to the creation of the atomic bomb, is perhaps the best-known example, although other examples of innovation include the deceptive tactics deployed by units such as the Ghost Army, which we actually recently covered on our other channel, Warfronts. However, this doesn't mean that the US military innovations were always a success. Sometimes the plans for new hardware were founded on ill-informed military dogma, such as the infamous gay bomb, which we've also covered. Other times, proposed projects were just downright goofy, having practically no chance of success, and probably, had they been incorporated, leading to nothing short of ridicule and potentially wanton loss of life. One such example was the so-called Bat Bomb, put forward at the height of the Second World War. And yes, that's exactly what it was called, and yes, it is exactly what the name would suggest. So let's get into it, shall we? In January 1942, the Second World War was in full swing. The tide had not yet turned against the Nazis, who'd kicked off Operation Barbarossa 6 months before and thrown themselves into a full-scale invasion of the Soviet Union, where by now they were preparing for what would become the famous and bloody siege of Stalingrad on the Volga River. The US, for its part, had 1 month prior suffered a surprise attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor and had pitched its lot in with the Allies on December 11th, 1941. With the American war machines now in motion, mobilization and weapons stockpiling was in full flow. But the US knew that the combined force of the German and Japanese militaries, not to mention their various state and non-state allies, would be a potent force to try and overcome, notwithstanding the significant stand so far made by the British and the Soviets in their respective theaters of war. Within 6 months of the American declaration of war, the Manhattan Project would take shape, devoting the contributions of some of the greatest scientific minds of the time to what would become one of the most destructive weapons imaginable, something which would see use only once in history to bring a decisive end to the stubborn Japanese resistance in the summer of 1945. Just before we continue, this video is brought to you by Gamer Supps. Yes, Gamer Supps make delicious zero sugar drinks, some with caffeine, some without. They sent me an insane amount of stuff to try. I've mostly been drinking the caffeinated dragon fruit punch because it's disgustingly good. And I just rotate Gamer Supps throughout my day. Some caffeinated, some non-caffeinated just for the hydration, drinking way less coffee, which is nice. Plus less than 40 cents a serving, and they let me keep this advert super short, so thank them by supporting them. Gamersupps.gg/megaprojects and use my code megaprojects for 10% off. Back to today's video. In the meantime, however, the US was seemingly willing to entertain much more farcical military notions put forward not by the likes of Robert Oppenheimer and Albert Einstein, but by people like Lytle S. Adams, a dentist from Pennsylvania. His proposal was the Bat Bomb, something he'd been inspired to propose while on a trip to a national park in New Mexico, possibly while absolutely spaced out on Novocaine. We don't have an explanation. Because the Bat Bomb, while never actually rolled out, was perhaps one of the most outlandish wartime ideas ever committed from mind to paper. Now you might ask, what business does a dentist have in contributing his notions to the fog of war? Well, like many walks of life, it all came down to connections. Adams was an acquaintance of First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, wife of four-time US President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Aside from being a dentist, he was also a pilot and part-time inventor. And his idea was to unleash hordes of bats upon Japanese targets in the hope that these bats, with little incendiary devices on them, would set fire to the wooden dwellings traditionally inhabited by the Japanese. This would result in an inferno, which would see Tokyo cook and result in a quick and decisive end to the war. It was in New Mexico, where coincidentally, one of the biggest breakthroughs in the war would be tested, that Adams derived inspiration for one of its dumbest. Around the time of the Pearl Harbor attack, Adams had been on holiday in the Carlsbad Caverns, a massive underground limestone complex featuring one of the largest subterranean chambers in the world. Resident in the cabins are around 17 species of bats, which in the 1940s may have encompassed a community of several million. Adams had observed that these nocturnal creatures would roost before dawn, giving rise to his idea that if an incendiary device of some kind, napalm for example, could somehow be strapped to these animals and they were released onto the tightly packed and highly flammable urban environment of cities like Tokyo, then that entire city could be reduced to ash in a flash. Adams was clearly a bit mad, but his idea, putting to one side of course its morality, was not without any merit. It is true that Japanese homes were mostly made of wood, and an effective incendiary attack would probably light them up fairly quickly. Adams's plan to use bats in the way described, while in no way humane, would at least be cheap and quick to employ, in theory. And the bats were, according to his reading, remarkably strong and agile, being able to carry a payload up to 3 times their body weight while airborne. In other words, a bat weighing roughly 9 grams would be able to carry a device which weighed something around 30 grams, converting itself into a lethal harbinger of war if employed effectively. It would just require capturing a couple of 100,000 bats and strapping some kind of Molotov cocktail to them, and then letting their flight patterns do the rest. It helped that Adams had absolutely no regard for the lives of the little creatures, describing them as the lowest form of life, associated in history with the underworld and regions of darkness and evil. He also added, "Until now, reasons for its creation have remained unexplained. As I vision it, the millions of bats that have for ages inhabited our belfries, tunnels, and caverns were placed there by God to await this hour to play their part in the scheme of free human existence and to frustrate any attempt of those who dare desecrate our way of life." Adams expounded on his wacky thoughts in a letter to the White House in early 1942. In his eyes, the bats were a kind of pest anyway, and a gift from Providence to help the US unleash unforgiving punishment upon the Japanese for their actions at Pearl Harbor. Like we said, he was a little bit mad. Now, at the very least, it seemed that such a plan would not take 3 years to develop, as would turn out to be the case with the atomic bomb. Adams also believed that the plan would be possible to execute in such a way that it would not lead to the mass loss of human life. He thought that it could level Japanese homes as well as industry, but would allow the population to mostly escape the inferno with their lives intact. In other words, a quick, cheap, and cunning weapon to be added to the military's arsenal. Now, look, none of that turned out to be true, but more on that later. As it happens, the month after Adams submitted his letter, Harvard organic chemist Louis Fraser invented napalm, a highly flammable, gelatinous liquid which was cheap to produce and which was later used to incinerate military and civilian populations in Japan and Vietnam. Perhaps with this invention in tow, President Theodore Roosevelt greenlit Adams's idea, declaring, "This man is not a nut. It sounds like a perfectly wild idea, but it is worth looking into." So, the plan was tentatively put into motion. The first challenge was to find a type of incendiary device light enough to be transported by the nocturnal agents of death. Despite their ability to carry a decent payload, no weapon yet existed which weighed less than 2 ounces, or about 56 grams. So, Dr. Pfizer was hauled out of his Harvard lab and set to work on a solution. Pfizer quickly managed to design a napalm bomb, complete with a timer, which weighed just 17.5 grams. The next stage was to choose the right kind of bat for the mission. For this, Adams enlisted researchers from the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles, ostensibly because he had some family there. It was determined that the Mexican free-tailed bat would be best suited for the operation. One of the most common bat species in North America, the Mexican free-tail weighed about 11 grams and was more than capable of carrying Pfizer's suicide pack if properly harnessed to its little body. Next, the project leaders needed to determine how exactly to deploy the bats from an overhead drop. It was decided to pack them into repurposed bombshells separated by circular trays with small nooks into which the bats could be placed while sleeping upside down. Each shell, containing around 1,000 bats, would be released with a parachute, and as the shell casing fell away, the bats would spring into action. Engineers assigned to work on the project expected that the bats would wake up as the shell descended, and when they pulled away from the case, they would trip wires which would arm the incendiary bomb strapped to them. It was also planned that each B-25 would be able to carry about 25 such shells, therefore a total of about 26,000 bats. The napalm, which would be used for the assignment, was stored in small, compact cellulose containers known as H2 units, which were glued to the torsos of the bats before they would be packed into the bombshells in order to carry out their reverse kamikaze attacks. So, with the hardware somewhat figured out, the stage was set for the first testing of the idea, which took place at the Muroc Air Base near Adams's home in Southern California. The testing hit several bumps in the road almost immediately. For one thing, Pfizer and other officers who visited Adams's house on the eve of the first test were shocked to discover that what was supposed to be a top-secret meeting was a dinner party attended by a large company of Adams's friends. The dentist had also collected about 150 bats for the tests, far fewer than the 3,000 that had been agreed upon. Things didn't get much better when the first test took place. Once deployed, the bats packed into the bombshell casing failed to wake up from their slumber, sailing straight to the ground around 600 meters below. It later emerged that they were not sleeping, but were in fact dead, since the cooling system used to calm them in transit had frozen them to death. The next tests went slightly better. These took place back in New Mexico, nearby the caverns from which the bats were collected, and on the site of the recently opened Carlsbad Army Air Base. A more modest cooling system was used, and the bats seemed to follow the intended flight pattern, scattering from the shell and running amok on nearby infrastructure. When test incendiary devices were added to the equation, more promising results still were yielded. The bats wreaked havoc, setting fire to the surrounding structures. However, this ended up causing several injuries, and the damaged infrastructure included several hangars and a car belonging to a Carlsbad barracks general. Unfortunately, due to the secrecy mandated by the project, few in the area had been made aware of the tests, and the men on site were no doubt unimpressed by their military installations spontaneously combusting into flames. So, in 1943, the project fell under the oversight of the Marines, and Adams was dumped from the project. The tests were renamed Project X-Ray, and the Marines ensured proper safety precautions were in place, carrying out further tests in California and Utah. After these seemed to offer continued positive results, the chief chemist supervising the tests even boasted that the incendiary bombs were more effective in fire starting than conventional bombs, declaring that a singular bomb load would give rise to as many as 4,700 fires, whereas a regular bomb load would start somewhere between 167 and 400. However, the testing of the project began to drag on, and by early 1944, Project X-Ray had still not been cleared for use in conflict. By this time, the US military was seeing success in the Pacific theater of conflict, with its island-hopping advance against the Japanese, and had also begun to set in motion its ground invasion of Europe, with Operation Overlord being mooted for the summer of that year. By now, the Bat Bomb Initiative had eaten up an estimated $2 million in budget, equivalent to around $18.7 million today. Moreover, positive results were beginning to come out of Los Alamos, where the Manhattan Project was nearing completion and would be employed to devastating and decisive effect in August 1945. It also happened that somebody in the US military unexpectedly saw clarity and realized that the plan, which warranted the slaughter of up to 1 million bats, had not only no guarantee of success, but was also likely to eat up even more expense in the hardware necessary to collect, pack up, transport, and deploy the flying critters to the Pacific. While the massive loss of human life, despite Adams's assurances that this would entail, was probably not a top concern, as displayed by the later use of the atomic bombs, it is likely that the vast expenditure of the project alone was enough to cause the US military to ultimately lose interest. So the Bat Bomb was wrapped up in the spring of 1944 with no definitive reason, other than the obvious, being issued for the sudden break in plans. Lytle Adams later continued his fledgling career as an inventor by proposing a fried chicken vending machine, as well as a similar project to his failed Bat Bomb idea, which would involve scattering agricultural plains synthetic grass seed in order to reforest burnt-out areas. Louis Weiser, for his part, was shipped back to his lab in Harvard, but his napalm invention did take off, being used to great and horrific effect, most notably in the Vietnam War. It was, in fact, also used before the end of the Second World War, notably in the incineration campaigns on the Japanese mainland carried out by US bombers in the lead-up to the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Weiser received several awards for his work in organic chemistry, and napalm remains in use in warfare today. It was suspected to have been used by the US military in its 2003 invasion of Iraq and has been added to the arsenal of several other military superpowers.